Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. My name is Susan Derwin, and I am the director of the IHC. As the public face of humanities for the campus, the center runs programs that draw upon the expertise, practice, and skills associated with the humanities to support scholars in their production of new knowledge and to empower community members as agents of social change. Thank you all for coming to today's event, which is sponsored by the IHC's Hester and Cedric Crowell Endowment and the UCSB Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Before I introduce our panelists, please allow me to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would also like to pay respect to elders past and present, as well as other Indigenous people present. And now to our panelists. Sir Isaac Julien is one of the leading artists working in film and video today. His work has been exhibited in major museums and galleries around the world, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, the San Diego Museum of Contemporary Art, as well as in Paris, Venice, South Korea, and Germany. A critically acclaimed filmmaker and installation artist, his films include the 1989 documentary drama Looking for Langston, which explores Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance, and the 1991 Young Soul Rebels, a coming-of-age film examining the interaction between youth culture movements during the late 1970s in the United Kingdom. The film won a prize at the Cannes Film Festival. Julien's recent international solo exhibitions include the immersive film installation Lina Bobardi, A Marvelous Entanglement, about the life, work, and legacy of the Italian-Brazilian modernist architect, the 10-screen film installation Lessons of the Hour, a meditation on the life and times of Frederick Douglass, Looking for Langston, an exploration of Langston Hughes in the Harlem Renaissance, and Playtime, which explores the subject of capital. In August of this year, Julien's work will be presented in a major retrospective at Tate Britain. He has taught at many institutions, including the University of the Arts London, Karlsruhe University of Arts and Design, and UC Santa Cruz, where he holds the position of Distinguished Professor of the Arts and leads the Isaac Julien Lab, together with arts professor Mark Nash. He is the recipient of the Royal Academy of Arts Charles Wollaston Award 2017, and last year was awarded a Goslar Kaiserling Award. Also in 2022, he was granted a knighthood as part of the Queen's Honor List, which noted that Julien had received his knighthood for services to diversity and inclusion in art. Yeah, can you believe that? I know, wait, I mean, this panel, let me tell you, okay, be patient, relax, settle in, okay? This is not the presentation. However, Mark Nash is a distinguished independent curator, including film historian and filmmaker with a specialization in contemporary fine art moving image practices and avant-garde and world cinema. He is currently a professor at UC Santa Cruz, where he co-founded the Isaac Julien Lab. And Nash has taught at many institutions, including Birkbeck College, University of London, the Whitney Museum in New York, NYU, and Harvard University. He was head of the Department for Curating Contemporary Art at the Royal College of Art in London. As a curator, Mark Nash has frequently collaborated with Isaac Julien on film and art projects. He also collaborated regularly with the late Aki Enwezor. Did I say it right? Aki Enwezor. And he has curated moving image exhibitions globally, including in 2017, Viva l'Italia at the Archaeological Civic Museum in Bologna. Nash has also written a book of critical essays with Duke University Press that will be released in April of this year, entitled Curating the Moving Image, in which Nash explores the possibilities of contemporary curation. Jeffrey Stewart is the Interim Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at UCSB and a Distinguished Professor and MacArthur Foundation Chair. He has taught in the Department of Black Studies at UCSB since 2007, when he was hired as chair of the department, a position he served in till 2016. Before coming to UCSB, he held numerous fellowships, visiting professorships, and lectureships, including at Harvard University, Yale University, UCLA, Tufts University, and the University of Rome. Stewart is the author of numerous articles, essays, edited volumes, and the book 1001 Things Everyone Should Know About African American History. His 2018 book, The New Negro, The Life of Alain Locke, is one of the few books of history that has won both the National Book Award for Nonfiction and the Pulitzer Prize for Biography, in addition to many other awards. Last year, Penguin Classics published The New Negro Aesthetic, Selected Writings by Alain Locke, which Stewart edited and introduced. And it's not over. I'm so glad we're doing this event today because, lo and behold, another book came out that was not even listed yet by Jeffrey. This is Beauty Born of Struggle, The Art of Black Washington. It came out a week ago. It's a collection of essays about an exhibition at the National Gallery in Washington. Did I get that right? Okay, here it is. It's beautiful. Get it. Jeffrey is also a curator, producing 2 major exhibitions with accompanying, 3 scholarly catalogs: To Color America, Portraits by Winold Reiss at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, and Paul Robeson, Artist and Citizen, that originated at the Zimmerli Museum of Art at Rutgers University and toured nationally. And our moderator today is Susan Solt, a distinguished professor of theater arts and former dean of the UC Santa Cruz Arts Division. It was while serving as arts dean that Solt created the opportunity for Isaac Julien and Mark Nash to join the UCSC faculty and found the Isaac Julien Lab at Santa Cruz. From fall 2020 to summer 2022, she was a visiting research fellow at the IHC. Prior to coming to UC Santa Cruz in 2016, for 21 years, Solt was on the faculty at Cal Arts, where she also served as Dean of Theater. She was the founding artistic director-producer as well of the Experimental Center for New Theater. As a film producer in New York City from 1982 through 1990, Solt worked with the late Academy Award-winning director Alan J. Pakula. She began her film career as Pakula's artistic coordinator on Sophie's Choice, which starred Meryl Streep, who won an Oscar for her performance, with Solt serving as her Polish language dialect coach. Pretty amazing. I mean, everyone beheld that accent, and here you are, the fount, the source. It's fantastic. After her tenure with Pakula, Solt served as Senior Vice President of Production for Miramax Films. As an independent producer for Warner Brothers, she produced the award-winning feature films Presumed Innocent and Doc Hollywood. I was very excited last year when Susan Solt proposed that we host today's dialogue at the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. I was excited for a number of reasons. First, because the event promised to bring together some of the most innovative and impactful artists and scholars working together today. And second, because the piece they will discuss, once again, Statues Never Die, is deeply interdisciplinary, structurally and intellectually, and in terms of its cultural and social reach. I want to thank Susan for giving our campus the opportunity to listen to this impressive panel of creative intellectuals and intellectual creators as they engage with one another today. Thank you. Isaac?
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I must say, it's such a pleasure to be back here in Santa Barbara. I have to say that it's a great pleasure to see this wonderful, esteemed crowd here. And it's wonderful to see people who have so inspired me in my work. So, Jeffrey, this project all begins with you. So this is the main thing that I want to say. With your immense scholarship and your wonderful book, which I have read several times and enabled me to make this work. But also to say, for me, coming to Santa Barbara and the way in which you have taken interdisciplinarity as really, in a way, the thing at the forefront. For me, it's really also an honor to see Constance Penley here and the wonderful work that she did in cinema studies for me, which was also very inspiring. And today, I'm going to talk a little bit about really collaborations and working here and being on the West Coast in Santa Cruz, thanking Susan for creating the possibility for us to work here and to, in a sense, make several projects. So the project Lessons for the Hour, the portrait of Frederick Douglass, and this work are all works which have developed out of our lab and sort of research processes. And in a sense, just to, in a way, begin, in a way, I say it starts with Jeffrey, because if you see the cover of Jeffrey's book on Alain Locke, you'll see that I've modeled my protagonist on that image. The New Negro and the Life of Alain Locke, was a total inspiration for making this work. And this, if you like, intense period of research and production for both Lessons of the Hour of Frederick Douglass and for this work, once again, Statues Never Die, in a way has been following a number of debates and questions, both here in the United States and Europe. Questions raised through the legacies of monuments, debates about restitution and reparations of African art. And in this contemporary piece at the moment, we think about how artists can create action and bring to the public critical knowledge that informs these debates. And I've been involved with Mark in re-examining research that points to early works such as Looking for Langston. And of course, this image here of Andrew Holland as Locke is quoting from this earlier work from 1989, Looking for Langston, which both Mark and I were involved in making while I was a member of the Sankofa Film Video Collective. And thinking about how the centrality of these debates about art and Black modernism, which I think has been a huge project of Jeffrey's, it was crucial for a sort of rearticulation of a new cultural movement. In a way, I was approached early on by Jeffrey to make a film about Alain Locke. And this conversation, which was based on his wonderful book, The New Negro, The Life of Alain Locke, inspired me in a way and haunted me when I was approached by the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia to create an installation in the celebration of its centenary. And I began thinking about Locke's insights into the Black arts and its relationship to the Barnes collection. And in a sense, this commission, in a way, presented the kind of possibility for making, once again, Statues Never Die as an immersive film installation exploring the relationship between Alain Locke, the culture theorist, the father of the Harlem Renaissance, and Dr. Albert C. Barnes, the early American collector and exhibitor of African material. So, of course, here is the very famous room, which you come across, for me, in the Barnes collection, where you have this interpolation happening between Modigliani, Picasso, the African mask sculptures, and this, in a way, scenography which gets created by Barnes amongst the spoons and the hooks, which, of course, is rather strange, but at the same time, I think marks his collection and his way of viewing in a particular way. Now, of course, if you go to Barnes' collection, we're in his ontological gaze, and he doesn't want us to be freed from it. And this is why the Barnes collection, to this very day, is assembled exactly how he wants it. But of course, making films, we can curatorially rearrange things. And that was precisely one of the things I wanted to do, inspired by Jeffrey's chapter on Barnes, called Battling the Barnes. And this conversation for me inspired both the actor, Andre Holland, and Danny Houston, who plays Barnes himself, where we were able to quote verbatim from a magazine which they both participated in. So as you know, the Barnes collection has a large collection of objects from Africa. They were acquired by Barnes, and that inspired Locke and the Harlem Renaissance artists. Tell me if I'm saying it wrong, Jeffrey. And how these objects entered the West, of course, is of much contemporary debate, which tends to overshadow, I would argue, debates about Black modernism, as one articulated them in the archive clip from Looking for Langston, where Alain Locke is introducing Richmond Barthé and his figurehead statue to a patron. And the quote at that particular moment by Stewart Hall goes something like this: white patrons of the Harlem Renaissance didn't want modernism, they wanted black art to keep art and artists in their place. So thinking about that in relationship to that quote, and thinking about this constellation here, which is one of the scenes shot in Pather, I was really interested in thinking about how these questions of both patronage and art, and in particular the role of Black aesthetics, would reconstruct archival scenes into tableaux vivants, which bring into focus both conversations between Locke and Barnes and the Harlem Renaissance to reflect on the influence the Barnes collection had on those artists' lives, and as in Looking for Langston, to juxtapose and contrast moments of contemporary debates around the nature of objects and artworks in the collection today. And this intersection between contemporary debates about statues and restitution, of course, a complex one for the Barnes Foundation and for artists today, because the history of colonial subjugation of peoples from Africa, of course, particularly Western Africa. But what is not much discussed is how these works are rearticulated and how they influence African-American artists, and indeed Alain Locke himself. And I wanted to explore this as an idea because it presents, I think, a powerful opportunity to create in the public sphere a moment for a thoughtful artistic exchange on these early encounters, which can be contrasted with contemporary debates. Hence, the film focuses on Locke's life around this time when he visited the Barnes collection in 1924, the year before he published The New Negro, an interpretation which was articulated for an African art as a central place in the philosophy and creative work of the movement. It also was a vital moment in African-American letters and cultural history. Once again, Section 11I aims to both honor Locke and his important contribution, inspired, as I said, by Jeffrey's work in the arts, and to explore the encounter between Barnes and to open up a critical conversations about the role of objects that simultaneously influence the Black cultural movement. And contrasting the modernist period, the contemporary, I wanted to bring voice into the film, that of a curator. And this is where Mark Nash comes in as a curator. He's going to take over this talk, because it's the creator and the role of the curator in the work, which for me is an important one, where we have as Black women protagonists in the work that's quoting from a Chris Marker work called Statues Also Die, which of course this film borrows its title from, and which engages with these questions.
So as Isaac said, this is the curatorial element, and we're starting with this image from the Chris Marker film that you may all see. And one of the main characters in Isaac's work, Statues Never Die, is this figure of a woman curator. The aim was that statues themselves are given a voice in the film, and the film enters into dialogue with archival imagery from the 1970 film You Hide Me by Nikwate Owu, Nigerian filmmaker at the London Film School, as well as with other visual references, a result of extensive research, such as a portfolio which we were recently introduced to by a colleague in the Goethe, by Walter von Rucketschell, which was made in 1921. Walter von Rucketschell drew the 10 sheets of this folder on stone, and Isaac filmed some of these sheets in, once again, Statues Never Lie. Better, this is Aimé Césaire, better if they had let those civilizations develop and flourish, rather than offering up scattered limbs, these dead limbs duly labeled for us to admire. Here in the museum, the rapture of self-gratification rots our eyes. The soundtrack, or the audio element of the piece, has a lot of quotations from key people, apart from Jeffrey, as we've mentioned. This is Aimé Césaire. Better if they'd let those civilizations develop and flourish, rather than offering up scattered limbs, these dead limbs duly labeled for us to admire. Here in the museum, the rapture of self-gratification rots our eyes. Here a secret contempt of others dries up our hearts. One of Isaac's aims with the film installation is to critically re-evaluate the legacies of Locke and Barnes, particularly in relation to debates about museum legacies. And Isaac looked forward to returning to themes of looking for Langston and the Harlem Renaissance and its connection to Locke and Barnes, and discussions of art and reparation in these contemporary debates. Once again, Statues Never Die is, in Isaac's phrase, a form of poetic restitution, and will create the impetus for a radical reconsideration of Black modernism and restitution. And his hope is that this will provide a space for reflection that influences these debates in arts and culture of museums generally. Once again, stars actor Andre Holland from Moonlight and Passing as Alain Locke, Danny Houston, there we are, Danny Houston from Succession and Marlowe as Dr. Barnes, and rising star Devon Terrell as sculptor Richmond Barté, and Charlene White, who was in Small Acts and His Lessons of the Hour as the curator. It also features a special appearance by singer and songwriter Alice Smith. Once again, Statues Never Die is also inspired by various textual references, poems, essays, and articles by Léon Gontran-Damas, Wole Soyinka, Aimé Césaire, Bell Hooks, and Dan Hicks. Isaac was working on it with his scriptwriter Martina Klitsch, and his collaborators were Dan Hicks, Professor of Contemporary Archaeology at the University of Oxford, and the author of influential Brutish Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution. Art historian, artist, and curator Professor Chika Okeke Agulu from the University of Princeton, an authority on African art, and leading activist in the redistribution movement. Krista Clark, who produced African art in the Barnes Foundation, The Triumph of L'Art Nègre and the Harlem Renaissance, the first comprehensive catalogue on the African objects collected by Barnes. Sorry, I continue? Yeah? Yeah, no, it's fine. Saving Isaac's voice for later. He's been in conversation with Tom Collins at the Barnes Foundation, who originally commissioned the project, and with the curators of the Sharjah Biennial, Hura Kasimi, Chiko Kekiagulu, and Salah Hassan. The work has been invited to the Sharjah by the Sharjah Art Foundation to be in the Sharjah Biennial opening in the next few weeks, which is being organized as a posthumous homage to Okri Enwezo, who envisaged it as a model for disrupting the power of artistic monolingualism and as a theoretical and physical space for thinking historically in the present. And this has very much inspired this project. Okri had a series of 3 major exhibitions while he was running the Haus der Kunst in Munich, and the final one couldn't be realized because of his untimely death. And so Isaac was one of the artists invited to contribute as a kind of memorial and continuing of his work. Thinking again about a new generation of Black artists, Isaac was also very interested in the work of Detroit-born Matthew Angelo Harrison, whose works feature in the film, and who is working with the images of sculpture and African objects. Harrison had his first solo exhibition in Europe at the Kunsthalle Basel in 2021. These contemporary influences of Black modernism and the diaspora show us the continuity of the role of statues in Black art and the legacy of Locke and Barnes. Once again, Statues Never Lie premiered at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia on the 15th of June in 2022. The work was presented alongside these statues by Matthew Angelo Harrison and Richmond Barthe. In fact, quite a lot of the work of Isaac's team was to get the physical statues into the exhibition, as you can see here. They were migrated from other galleries in the Barnes collection and from elsewhere.
So, just to conclude, in a way, as I said, this is a project which, was developed both for our teaching, and we have, like a special guest here with us, Joseph Finkel, who has travelled with us as a student in the lab and works with us. And one of the things which was very inspiring about being in the lab and teaching here was the way in which his contribution and his interest in a composer which was very central to these scenes. You can help me remember his name, Joseph. Harold Budd. Someone who is a well-known composer on the West Coast, who was a minimalist, who was, in a way, I would say, in the introduction to his sonic work by Joseph, in a way, was able to create these scenes, these encounters between looking at the work of Barthe, where we were able to arrange a whole exhibition for the film and have a Barthe character who Jeffrey met in real life. And then again, Jeffrey's conversations were very inspiring, both for the actor Terrell who played the role, and also for me in thinking about how he would perform, and indeed for Andrea Holland. And the combination between having access to this kind of sonic intervention in the film enabled it to cross time and to suture these different historical moments together in a way that would have never materialized had I just been in that Brexit blighty island, London, where we live part of the time. So it's these encounters which really enable a kind of flourishing where the questions around the gaze, questions which were explored 35 years ago or more or less in Looking for Langston, that were brought alive in this kind of sonic encounter, intergenerational encounter, which the lab provided. And in a way, I think it's this kind of critical aspect of the research, the way in which the humanities and the arts intertwine in the production of these works, which enables a really exciting engagement for thinking about once again, and maybe this is where we could stop and we can have a conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isaac, and thank you, Mark, very much. And I'm blocking, so I'm going to move.
don't worry.
Well, please. That was pretty amazing to see those images, and process was promised, that we would understand or learn more about the process of the way Isaac Julien makes work. And I think you saw a lot of what was going on there in a 35-year collaboration between two creative partners, Mark Nash and Isaac Julien. And I think that also, I just want to say one thing about the issue of Isaac's award to be knighted by the King of England for his contributions to diversity and equity and inclusion in the arts, really, I think, is exemplified in his work, in the way he works, which is to curate rather than to impose, and to involve us all in the way he sees and the way he knows. And that's what he brings to us. And so an impulse to do a collaboration with the Barnes Foundation creates this multi-layered, multi-dimensional work, and also fits right in with Susan Derwin's theme of history, the history of information, because I think that we saw a cycle of information about the same objects in conversation in the 1920s, and now in conversation in the 2020s. So, to say that. And I want to turn first to Jeffrey Stewart, because what Jeffrey really wants is to have a dialogue with Isaac, and I am really dying to hear your response to the work you've seen and what you saw today.
No, I hope can you hear me? Yeah. No, I'm...
Turn it on, Jeffrey. I'm sorry.
Oh,
No, it's a button on your,
better?
in your,
Better? Button?
yeah.
Let's get the button, man. Where that button at? Is that the button?
There it is. That's a button.
I don't know. Anyway, was just taking us back into the 1930s black film. Anyway, wow, I mean, it's an incredible honor to, a historian who spends a lot of time trying to get all of these weird little stories right, and then to have an artist come and retell that story in film. And particularly as a kind of symbolic, to me, a kind of symbolic journey of these objects, right? Because of course the pivot is of course the objects, but of course everybody focuses on the people, right? But what I like about is that it's the story of Locke and Barnes, but they're like haunted in a way by these objects who in a way don't get to speak, right? But they have to speak through humans. And those humans are always mistranslating, it seems to me, the objects perhaps yearning into contemporary agendas. So Barnes, of course, had discovered these objects in Paris and really was an innovator, quite frankly, in making the case with Guillaume and others that African art had so influenced, really caused modern art, or at least French modern art, particularly Cubism, roughly the period 1905, say, to 1915 or so. I mean, that period of time was greatly influenced through Picasso and others, Modigliani and others. I have to tell a little personal story, though. When I went to Yale as a graduate student, and I was from California, and I had all this sort of 60s critique, and I was in a class taught by Warren Sussman, and we were talking about modernism. And I said, well, modernism to me seems predominantly a way for, European artists to rip off African and non-Western artists. And everybody just like exploded. They attacked me, and they said, well, give us an example. I said, well, Picasso. And they said, oh, no, what about his Spanish roots? They went, it was everything but Africa. And then later on, there was that exhibition that was criticized, Primitivism in in modern art, that really showed almost one-to-one relationship between objects that had been collected by these artists and what they did. I mean, they didn't even really improvise that much. And what was interesting about the Barnes collection, Barnes, is that he collected those. In other words, he collected the African piece and the modern piece and put them up in his gallery, which made it unmistakable. So when he invited Locke to come to the gallery, and Locke saw this, and then he listened to Barnes go on and on about how great he was and everything, I think it made a connection to him that he wouldn't have made without Barnes. And so Barnes really made a huge contribution then. But by the middle of the 1930s, a man named Robert Goldwater came along, and his book on primitivism in modern art. And he said, oh, no, it can't be that, because African artists weren't primitive, which is obviously true. And modern artists were just, misreading, and there was really no connection. So particularly for the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, I'm glad you were able to speak there, brother. MoMA hasn't always been that friendly to African-American or African diasporic artists. But nevertheless, they really pushed the idea that there was no connection. And it was really only to the 60s and 70s that Black artists and curators and started saying, well, wait a minute, And I had that experience of reflecting that discourse at Yale and being sort of put down for it. And it was heavily policed. So Barnes, often is considered a bad guy. He was, a narcissist, although that's a lot more frequent in our public culture now. But he was, he made this discovery, and he wanted everybody to know he'd made this discovery, and like he was, and he was a megalomaniac and a power hungry. He had these Black people who worked in his company, and he would teach them about African art, and he thought himself really very progressive in that, but he was a little more uncomfortable with Black people who were as educated or more educated than him. And so you see this in the film, it's where you have them kind of going around one another. They're facing off.
Right.
And of course, the Barnes is, as I think you say in a couple of places, that there was a 1924 issue of Opportunity magazine that was Locke kind of guest curated. And Barnes's artwork was in it. It was the first time that African art was really in a sort of civil rights journal in the United States. And, Barnes contributed his article and his art, and Locke contributed his article. And when Barnes read Locke's article, he saw that Locke had basically taken all of his ideas and repurposed them to his agenda, which was to launch African-American contemporary artists. Not so much just to be kind of, living in the past. And this actually was something that Barnes wasn't that much in favor of. He was part of that group that felt that African art had been created by people who had a religious consciousness, and that consciousness was gone, and so it could never be. But then he learned something from Locke too, and he began to have African-American artists at the foundation.
But Jeffrey, you said something to me that I thought was so interesting, that you felt that Barnes needed Locke because he was Black in order.
Yeah. I mean, there was a mutual use there.
Yeah.
Of course, Barnes had the money, right? And Charles Johnson, who was the editor of Opportunity magazine, and Locke were hoping that Barnes would help finance the Harlem Renaissance.
But that Locke was like a validation for Barnes.
Well, yeah, well, he was a Rhodes Scholar. Yeah. He was at Howard University. Yeah. He would be a good advertising frontman for Barnes. So, who had other black people who were working for him in that way too, as well as European curators and artists. Also Bertrand Russell. Yeah. He tried to actually get Bertrand Russell to be his front man at a certain point.
But what's interesting, Isaac, what you've done here is, and Jeffrey hasn't called you out for it, is you invented a dialogue between Barnes and Locke to get these ideas across. And it seems to me that the overriding sort of idea that you want us to take away from this is a understanding that this was the first introduction to African art, and that the whole issue now we're coming to in this day and age is the concern of repatriating that art. So it's very ironic that here we are celebrating its first encounter with the world, and now we're and now we're talking about, do we need to send it back? Could you and Mark both speak to that, please?
Can I?
Yeah, you can into that.
Yeah, before that, Susan, I was just thinking that actually what happens in the film is also a reflection on Isaac's own filmmaking practice, because there's a heavy is the wrong word, but there's an extensive quotation from Looking for Langston, which was the 1989 film that I helped research with Isaac. And in that film, way before Jeffrey was really working on this project, we discovered very, very little footage of work from that Harlem Renaissance period. But it turns out that some of the material we found was actually of Barnes. And so what Isaac managed to do in, once again, Statues, is to rework and quote from his own film about the Harlem Renaissance. So you have these sort of multiple layers of the Harlem Renaissance being reflected on in film in 1989, and then again today. So there's that kind of complex layering that goes on. As far as the restitution argument goes, I think it's quite a kind of contentious debate, and I mean, I think what's good about the way the film handles it is that it doesn't really take sides. Mm-hmm. It quotes the violence of the Benin expedition. It quotes from Aimé Césaire. It exposes this as an issue, but it doesn't take a position on what should be repatriated or what would work better there rather than here, because some people are, even Chike Okeke is somebody who is very active in the repatriation movement, but he himself says that there's a big issue as to where you repatriate and for whom. It's a complex question. So I think what's important about Isaac's film is don't you think, Isaac, it sort of skirts those issues deliberately so that it can be said as a question mark for the audience.
Yes, and I think in a way, I mean, one of the things which was very inspiring to me in relationship to Jeffrey's work, which is really how you can, at one point, translate the kind of literary kind of research and, in a way, reconstruction, archival reconstruction, which Jeffrey brings to life in his work, and how that then becomes a kind of way of being able to work with actors, because Andrea Holland read the whole biography, and so did Terrell, the younger actor who plays Barte, and in a way they're interpolated by that in their performances, and then the translation of that becomes part of the way in which you're able to then have the other filmic quotational aspect in relationship to Looking for Langston, because when we came across the archive footage that Mark had been working on in Looking for Langston, and we didn't know that was Alain Locke when we were making the film in 1989. It was only after a couple of years that we were able to speak to a historian, Deborah Willis, who was able to if you like, look at that archival footage and name all the artists in that footage. And that's when, in a sense, it was brought to life. That's when we were able to bring to life, if you like, the connection. So in a way, there's a reparational work in statues in relationship to Looking for Langston, in bringing together these figures which existed, let's say, archivally. And then, of course, you have the extra reconstruction because you have these characters come to life in the performance. So the performative and the literary and the kind of cinematic all collide in the construction of, making the work and bringing together these sort of elements.
And in bringing those elements together, take us again through how you got to this title.
Well, once again is the song that Alice Smith wrote for the film. That's the title of her song. Alice Smith lives in Los Angeles. As you know, she's a very important artist and singer. And through her performance and through her interpretation of the chapter that she read, because I gave everybody Jeffrey's chapter on Barnes and Alain Locke, she kind of constructed this song. Once again, it's really much a song that's really encapsulating within it the return of modernism, the return of these debates, and she's personalizing that in her song, which makes an epilogue to the end of the work, but is her presence through the museum is one which is kind of, in a way, haunting the film. And then, of course, statues never die is a pun on Chris Marker's statues also die. And there's a quote that Mark had mentioned, did a Chris Marker film. And of course, his film was banned when it was first made, but it took a whole generation to appreciate that work. But of course, as indicated both by Mark and Susan, we are in this moment where these questions are being re-examined, and it's a very hot debate, which I think, to a certain extent, if we think about the Benins statues, they were taken very violently. I was able to work with Dan Hicks, who is the author of the Brutish Museum, who works as the creator of the Pitt Rivers Museum, and also realized that Alain Locke must have gone to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford when he was a Rhodes Scholar, and would have seen these kind of objects, as well as going to Garmet's gallery in Paris at the same time as Barnes. But I mean, in a way, I think if you hadn't written and done that amazing research, Jeffrey, then we wouldn't have had the access to really work with a certain knowledge in the construction of these images.
So was it from Jeffrey's work when you were asked to do a commission by the Barnes to honor their 100-year anniversary that you already had in mind that connection came immediately to you? Or how did you come to Alain Locke as your way into the Barnes to Centenary?
Well, of course, it was precisely that, yes, to be able to see the collection through Locke's eyes, and at the same time to have this contemporary look through the curator's eyes, who I see as a composite of bell hooks and the kind of woman protagonist in Chris Marker's film, because of course it's bell hooks' text which performs the epilogue and makes a connection to snow and winter as a kind of form of mourning around these sorts of questions, as a kind of counter discourse to, if you like, Locke, in relationship to the role of the artist, I guess specifically the role of the black artist, but thinking about the artist and the question of the imagination as being something that's a key important for agency, and how you can perhaps escape the binarisms that you get politically held into, you know, so.
And Jeffrey, you mentioned storytelling, and it seems, and really offering your way of telling Locke's life as one kind of storytelling, and Isaac's is another kind of storytelling and telling. And as an historian, how do you reconcile both? Or do you, I mean, would you want your students to see this film? And,
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It'd take away one more day, right? Yes, well, I mean, I think, back to your other point about why go to Locke in a commission about Barnes. I mean, I think that, you know, most artists have a certain level of resistance to the politics of commissions, right? I mean, commissions are great, but, you know, do you want to make a hagiography about Barnes?
Yeah. Which
they might like, right? And yet Barnes is such a complex figure. It seems to me that what you know, Isaac does is makes a dialectical film, one in which Barnes's assertions are countered by Locke's assertions. And we see that dialectic staged where they're talking to one another. We don't actually know if they did talk to one another. They may actually have talked. I just don't know that that occurred like that. I suspect that the first time that Locke went to the Barnes Foundation, Barnes did all the talking, because he was a guy that liked to talk. And Locke was smart enough to let him talk, you see. I think that he underestimated Locke, because most of the other people that Barnes talked to, young, say, civil rights Black people, getting the aesthetic importance of these objects wasn't really easy for them. But once Locke had been immersed in aesthetics all along, so when he saw the argument, he could say, oh, okay, I see this. And then when he curated this special issue, he played it out through the whole issue with the selection of objects. So in his article, he has a, I guess it's a Zullini, I can't pronounce the name, sculpture, and a Modigliani, and he has them right next to one another. And you can see that it's not that basically Modigliani copied the other one. You can see it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was Barnes' argument, but it was in Locke's essay.
You know, I went
so he had actually curated the idea into his essay, and then Barnes's essay, which, you know, everyone said that Barnes had a thing about that he wasn't that good a writer, and he became quite a good writer later, but at that point he wasn't. His essay was quite pedestrian, quite comparative, and he thought, oh, you know, this Negro has come and stolen the information and put it out there better than me. That had to burn, especially in 1924. I mean, that happens more often now, but you know, I'm just saying.
But you also mentioned to me the Black community's response, though, that they had a very different reaction to the idea that this work was being used simply to prove that there was some relationship between...
Yeah, I mean, eventually, but I don't think at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, at that time, connecting African art to modernism, which all the people were raving about, meant that essentially, which Locke says in essays, we were there before them. We were doing modern art. We were doing conceptual art. And they kind of came to that after they went through the whole portal of representation in the 19th century. And so yeah, I mean, it was a great status. And Barnes was supportive of that notion. In other words, he was supportive of the idea that Black people in the United States didn't get credit that they deserved. Mm-hmm. The other thing you have to remember is that in 1924, there weren't very many places in the United States that you could see African art. I mean, it was Barnes' foundation, and there was the Brooklyn Museum. And that was pretty much it. So it was a revolutionary statement at the time. And it also said that Black people were involved in something more than just civil rights, which was kind of the Crisis, which is a magazine of the National Association of Colored People, which Du Bois Johnson's thing was a cultural intervention, with a cultural turn. Not everybody picked it up and said, oh God, isn't this great, we've got this art, because there was a strong religious reaction against African art in the Christian community and the black community, which always wasn't very positive. And of course, many of the black artists had difficulty doing what Locke wanted them to do, which was to use this art to create their own modernist art. I think Locke himself had a hard time realizing that African art for white artists meant something quite different than what it would mean for black artists.
It's very, very interesting. And we're going to just finish on this because I do want Isaac and Mark to address what Jeffrey just was telling us in this way. The issue of commission and the way in which the two of you are intellectual and creative partners, but that you go to these experts, and you have always been deeply immersed in research, and you've been collaborators with Stewart Hall and with Paul Gilroy, but there is the capacity to embrace a 1,000-page book, and make a film.
It's 993, I think.
Is it? All right, I read it.
I think you're really accurate here.
But this process is, to me, an extraordinarily unusual way in which you work.
Well, I'll start off and then Isaac can come
And that'll
in, because
be it.
I would say that Isaac does a lot of that research. Isaac's forever reading, exploring, discovered Jeffrey's book. He has a kind of instinct for what's happening, what people are talking about, and I think for me the magical thing about that film is the way it looks back at the Looking for Langston film, but at the same time it's a continuation of the kind of exploration of the Harlem Renaissance. It's creating a new, more expanded version of the Harlem Renaissance. And I think what worked incredibly well in this whole commission was the marriage with the Barnes collection, because we were invited, Isaac was invited by Tom Collins, and we thought they were never going to agree to the kinds of project Isaac and I would be interested in. And in fact, it was possible to film in that incredibly difficult space. I mean, very tight spaces with all these amazing works of art, that you were invited into this place, even though my own take on it, as Isaac mentioned, is it's a little bit like a morgue as well, because it's as though it's still haunted by Barnes, because everything is exactly as it would be if Barnes was still alive, and you could read, there's a sort of psychoanalytic reading of it as, in a way, Barnes' monument to himself through this.
Yes, but it's also what Jeffrey was saying is that he forced people to see the art in ways they hadn't before. It's almost as if he's afraid if it wasn't curated in that way, people would not get.
Yeah.
And he couldn't accept that over time, this would evolve.
And he hated the art establishment. That's why he would never give it to the Philadelphia Museum of Art or anything. He hated art historians and the whole framework in which that was done.
All right, Isaac, give us the last word, and then we'll have some questions from the audience.
Well, I want to just say one thing before that.
All right.
I think that one thing that is really important is, we were talking about, is the rape of the people that occurred for this, particularly the part you have in there about the Benin expedition and the destruction, 1893. I think you have
97.
Yeah. You have some diaries of the people who carried this out, and so what you bring to this work is not only, as I said before, a sympathetic view of Locke, which is hard to do. Believe me, I know, brother. But also, there's a kind of haunting that goes throughout this film, where you're haunted by the specter of what was done, even though you've got these beautiful art objects to look at. It's in the gaze of the people looking at it. You just feel this incredible loss that occurred, even though, and without the idea that simply repatriating or restituting them will solve it. That loss is still there. And it really comes through in the film in a beautiful way. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I think that's absolutely the case. In the sense, I think, it was really through the kind of epilogue with Alice Smith's song, where you have this question of the haunting. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm into hauntology, but in a way, this work is a work which is very much, connected to those aspects, the omnipresence of Barnes, and how can one look through it, and how can one, in a way, try to bring together this more contemporized thought to these debates, which are once again returning to the forefront, but in a different manner. So I think, I think it's a work which I'm hoping, that it will become shown, West Coast at some point.
Yeah, it would have been nice to have it here.
It'd be wonderful.
Well, you all can view it on your computers.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you can view it.
Yeah.
It's the wonderful thing about technology and the brilliant way.
And thank you for that, Isaac.
That you can actually view the film in your own time as a 5-screen work.
But that's not the same thing.
No.
Sorry, that's not the same thing as seeing the work. It's a version, isn't it? And it's an important version. But because of the innovations that Isaac brought in, which we haven't talked about so much, in the mise en scène of this work, there were like 2 or 3 groups of African statues, so that there was this kind of passage between the film and real items from the Barnes collection and elsewhere, as well as the contemporary Matthew Angelo Harrison work. So there was this movement between, this is an art gallery or is this a film installation? And then at an access to that, there was the use of reflective mylar so that the visitor finds themselves incorporated into the installation. So that those are 2 quite special and kind of radical display techniques in a way, which make that, really special. So,
Right.
yeah, so it should be.
Well, I think the word we need to reintroduce, which you've used, is immersive. You live in that installation. You are wandering through it, and you have this marvelous multi-screen experience of a film. It's very different from the films that I made. Anyway, thank you. I think we're going to let the audience have some questions now. Yeah. Thank you so much. Aaron.
Raise your hands and the mic will come to you.
Is anyone out there with a question? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the casting process? In particular,
Casting.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you talk a little bit about the casting process? I'm interested in the Alain Locke character and Barnes's character. I thought it was just really genius that you put Danny Houston in there, but yeah.
Well, lucky for me, I have a friend, his name's called Stewart, who works with a wonderful casting agent in London, very unassuming, Gary, who you kind of say would be wonderful to have. Who would you think would be, so in a way there's a little bit of a kind of Hollywood aspect in relationship to like the strategy, but I mean, I think also once you have someone, for example, like Danny Houston, then you have to persuade Danny Houston to a certain extent, because he doesn't want to be completely set up, in a way, and he knows that the Barnes figure is a little, controversial, I think once he went to the Barnes Museum and saw his collection, of course the uncanny aspect was once we, with the costume designer and, stylist, sort of constructed him as Barnes, there was a very uncanny moment for everybody working in the museum because he looked so much like him, and so I think this question of mimicry and also casting in a detailed manner is very important, and that also, of course, a kind of performance aspect. But I think the other thing that was also interesting about Danny Houston is that he was familiarized with my work, and he understood the nature of it as a multiple screen film, because he's a filmmaker himself, and of course his father, John Houston, being a important filmmaker. He was very familiarized with film in itself, and so he was very fascinated around the technique and.
If I could also just add to this that Isaac also has a very keen eye for the people he would like to have in his films, and sometimes he pursues them over, if not decades, certainly.
He's also a bit modest because he isn't just a friend of Steve McQueen, he was his teacher. Even though he was very young when he was a professor. Sorry, Mark.
But what I meant to say is having seen Andre Holland in Moonlight and another project, Isaac says, this is the person I want to play the character, so I'm going to get him. And starts this process of seduction, which is what is involved. And it's showing the work and meeting and having meals and all the things that you would do for a major motion picture to get somebody to come into your project.
Or university.
Yeah.
Andre Holland's very interesting because he's someone who has actually wants to do literature and has studied in Princeton and Harvard, and said to me that he'd be interested in not acting anymore. He's been active for a very long time, and he's really interested in all the debates. So he was reading Christina Sharp's book, The Wake, and things like that.
All right.
So he's a very sophisticated actor that's very familiarized with all kind of literary debates, theoretical debates, and read Jeffrey's book Inside Out, and he's an amazing actor with a certain interiority, I think, in terms of.
Great. Anybody else? We have another question? Yeah.
So I was trying to wonder, I had this question, I was trying to figure out how to phrase it, but so the power that comes out of watching the multiple screens is really something. And having just seen one of your things in a smaller scale in San Francisco, and then watching this on my iPad screen, I'm really taken by the way the emotions or the rhythm of the different screens playing with each other, with the music, with the dialogue. It's rather mesmerizing, and I just sort of felt carried in this flow of your images and the words. I wondered where you came up with this. Is anyone else doing the multiple screen? Did you see it somewhere? I just wonder where.
Yeah, how'd you come up with that, brother?
Are you the only guy doing this? So anyway, it's so powerful within this single screen in storytelling that,
Great.
Thank you for it. But I wonder, where did it come from?
Okay. Yeah.
Well, it has a long history in sort of, cinema studies, or think about Abigail Gantz's Napoleon silent film classic that goes into 3 screens at the end of its finale. But then also I think in, video art, you've had people who've experimented with multiple screen. I mean, Andrew Pykoff is your obvious example, but I mean to say that a younger generation, or not so young generation now, like myself, basically at a particular moment, I would say in the 90s, with the change of new technologies, you were able to show works in a museum and gallery context, and people started to experiment with multiple screen works. So, but you have lots of people working in this area as a kind of, you could call it a genre. You had Doug Aiken, of course, in Los Angeles, Stan Douglas in Canada, Steve McQueen, when he first started making films, made multiple screen works, which were, in a way, utilizing the more experimental nature of film. But you also had, Ulysses Jenkins, the video artist who taught here in the West Coast for a very long time, recently had an exhibition at the Hammer Museum, and the work that he was doing, for me, was a revelation. It was incredible. And so you've had those echoes, but I guess, you know, in these works, it's also the cinematic history that I want to bring into them, and I'm interested in narrative and breaking up a narrative and telling stories across these different sort of screens, and to entice the audience into this form. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah. It's a great question.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. I've been a fan, Isaac, for many years. I met you at CalArts like over 20-something years ago, so it was very memorable. My question directly is going into the film to space realm, but also looking at contemporary technologies in filmmaking, as in immersive filmmaking using caves, or what we have here is an Allosphere instrument. It's a $20 million facility that we made a player for film. So my question for you would be, what do you see the future of filmmaking with these technologies of immersion? Headset or with people in a space?
Well, you know, I came to the West Coast because I kept thinking immersive technologies, VR, that's here, you know, in terms of technologies. It's in Asia, like, you know, Japan and Korea. It's in the Pacific area, the Pacific Rim cultures. You know, this is at the forefront. You have wonderful collections here. Kramnik collection in Napa Valley, it's a private collection of Moving Image. You have the Lucas Museum, which will open soon. And also you have the museum, the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures, which I have to say, I thought is pretty good for a museum that deals with that cinematic history, because sometimes it can be a bit scary. So I think it's a wonderful coming together and concentration of these kind of technologies. You know, but the only thing I can say is that but the problem with VR for me is I suffer from claustrophobia, so I couldn't really be even in the back of the car. So to put these over you, and you have to look, I can't do it that well. And so, but also the other thing that I feel when I'm making Lessons of the Hour, the Frederick Douglass work, who, of course, he was interested in technologies and photography. I'm thinking about that kind of 19th century sort of, I forget the name of it now.
That you hold.
Daguerreotype?
But
Stereotype.
stereograph, yeah.
Yeah.
Stereograph.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stereoscope. Thank you, Constance.
Yeah.
You know, and, you know, in the film we have him look into that because that's the technology that people are looking at. And I kind of feel like VR is like 19th century, to my mind, as a technology. It's not kind of, you know, so of course I'm for that experience to be something that's more experienced, you know, not enclosed, you know, so, but then of course, you know, you've had expanded notion of going to see we went to Tokyo, remember Mark, and we went to that place where they had expanded spaces.
Oh yeah, I've forgotten the name though.
It was sort of something lab, but you
Team
know,
lab.
Team lab.
Yeah.
Where you go into the immersive space of, you know, a Van Gogh painting, but you're walking in the space. You know, that experience.
A complete nightmare.
Which is a horror. You know. It's a horror, you know. So, I don't know, there's something horrifying about the way that new technologies are going to contaminate how you view and how you see, you know, because I'm someone who works with this technology, but I don't really like it that much at the same time, you know, so I have an ambivalence around it. But I have this cinephilic relationship too, so I don't know if that answers your question.
Let's take one more question, then we have a reception where we can continue our conversation.
Great.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Mireille Miller-Young, and I'm in feminist studies. I met you like 20 years ago when you were here, and we had this amazing conversation in the space, and I still carry it with me. You're one of my heroes, so I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you. Okay, so a bit of a serious question, given there's a lot of conversation about the role of film and technology, given the broadcasting of the murder of Tyree Nichols and the new role that film is taking in documenting Black death. And I wonder if you could meditate on this moment where we are with the visuality of Black life and death, and what you hope to do as an artist in immersing people in another kind of Black experience of creativity and imagination, how you see that working against the kind of space that we're in right now with the quick construction and dissemination of these other kind of images. When that came out the other day, a bunch of us were on a call because it's we know this happens all the time, but there's something about the way that when the footage would happen that none of us wanted to look, but we were called to look anyway and kind of witness it. And so we're being brought in whole new ways through film to state violence against Black bodies. So to know if you had thoughts on that. Thank you.
I know you were waiting for that question. When did you come?
I mean, at the end of Lessons of the Hour, the Frederick Douglass work, there's a moment where you have, Douglass has a kind of very, like you could say, enthusiastic relationship to photography and technology at that particular time. It's going to create agency, and, in a way, Black subjects are going to have, a sort of power, and they did in terms of being able to re-image themselves and not be in the kind of caricature world of the dominant sort of technologies at that time, and so photography played this emancipatory role, but of course, the flip side in the 21st century is the way in which, for example, drone footage is mapping the Freddie Gray riots, which appears at the end of the work. And so in a way, there is a kind of darker side to technologies. And I think, that aerial shot that you have at the end of Lessons of the Hour, you have the subjects who are protesting, that kind of technology is used also for when people are going to be targeted, So in a way, sometimes the technology can predict, I think, what could happen in the future. So it has a worrying aspect for me. When I look at that image and I juxtapose it with Douglass's words from the 19th century. So I think, in a way, one's right to be worried about how those images circulate. But I think at the same time, they have been the cause for the catalyst of, Black Lives Matter, and that was something that really did change a lot of things, I think, and we still have the repercussions of it. But I think, this is when I go back to cinema studies with Mark and Constance, the question of the scopophilia aspect and the way that, do you know what I mean, that's going to be something of an obsession, and it's something which I think, as artists, we should think about. It makes me go to Bell Hooks and her text at the end of the film Winter about the question of the imagination and how that role is really important. But at the same time, we do have a discourse that's being articulated, which is quite a strong one. But I can't think of, Jeff, we've had these conversations.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you bring that question because it's the circulation of trauma, which is what these films do, and and especially this last one where it's 3 different films, And so that, you know, it's almost a triptych, right? Which is, of course, back to this whole multi-screen kind of, it's more mesmerizing and torturing. And there's trauma in this film, too. I think the way that you end with the snow falling on Locke and him in that kind of meditative, almost literary, it makes sense if he's trying to move into literature, I think has a kind of deliverance to it. It's a feeling of deliverance as possible. And so perhaps that's one role that the filmmaker can begin to do is just to chart out, and I think you're trying to in there, what does the future entails? What are these objects and the history that we can't get away from? Tell us about what's possible in the future rather than just, okay, repatriation is probably a logic that has to play out, but how do we move forward and use these objects and their incredible power to imagine a different world? And that last scene with the snow gives us a sense that Locke is trying to do that. He's trapped in his own time, in his own way of thinking, but it's almost like an embrace of him with the snow that I thought was very, very, very powerful. And just thinking of Bell Hooks, who's recently passed on, and you know, it's been a tremendous period of Black death we've come through just with COVID. There's so many artists who are in that book, you know, that Susan was holding up, passed away during the process. So it's something that we're navigating all the time.
Thank you.